The mist hung heavy over the Volkhov River in 862, a wall of gray that swallowed the sky and the shoreline alike. Beneath the surface, the current pulled hard against the wooden hull of the longship. The rhythmic, synchronized thud of oars against rowlocks echoed. Then, the sound stopped. The oars lifted, dripping water back into the river, and the ship drifted into the silence. Rurik stood at the prow, his weight balanced against the gentle sway of the deck. He stared into the white void ahead, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. This was not a journey for silver or furs. The merchants had passed this way before, seeking profit. Rurik did not come to trade. He came to command. The ship groaned as it scraped against the muddy bank, the keel biting deep into the earth. He stepped off the deck, his boots sinking into the soft soil of the riverbank. He did not look back at the water. He turned his gaze toward the dark tree line, where the future of the land waited to be seized. The era of the wanderer ended here. The era of the ruler began. The forest floor yielded under the weight of the approaching force. Rurik moved with purpose, his scouts fanning out to secure the river crossings. The local tribes, long accustomed to their own fragmented rule, met the newcomers with steel and fire. They held the high ground, their arrows biting into the trees, but the momentum was not theirs to keep. The Varangians pushed forward, shields locked, closing the distance with rhythmic, relentless pressure. One by one, the tribal strongholds fell silent. The resistance crumbled as the reality of a new authority took hold. Rurik claimed villages, not burned. Elders bowed. The scattered settlements were bound together, not by choice, but by the necessity of survival under a singular command. The fragmentation ended, and the structure of a nation began to rise from the soil. The Dnieper River surged southward, a wide, churning ribbon of water that became the lifeblood of the new state. Where once only local skiffs drifted, now heavy barges crowded the current, their holds packed with wax, furs, and honey. The river was no longer just a path. It was a golden artery pumping wealth directly into the heart of Kiev. Merchants from the Baltic north navigated the treacherous rapids, their poles striking the riverbed with rhythmic precision. At the narrow bends, the water roared against the limestone cliffs, threatening to crush the wooden hulls, but the crews held their course. They pushed through the spray, driven by the lure of the Byzantine markets waiting at the river's end. As the barges docked at the Kievan wharves, the air filled with the clamor of exchange. Foreign tongues mixed with local dialects, and the scent of exotic spices drifted across the docks. The city grew upward, stone by stone, fueled by the relentless flow of goods. Kiev became a mirror of the world beyond its borders, absorbing the art, the ideas, and the sheer scale of the southern empires. The year 988 arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness over the hills of Kiev. The city had grown vast, but its spirit remained divided. Between the old ways and the rising influence of the south, Vladimir the Great stood on the high bank, watching the Dnieper churn below. He had weighed the alliances, the trade, and the future of his people for months. The decision was no longer a matter of policy. It was a matter of survival. He turned away from the wooden altars that had stood for generations and began the long descent toward the water. The crowd followed, thousands of feet crushing the dry grass, yet no one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic slap of the river against the limestone piers. As he reached the muddy edge, he stopped. He plunged into the icy grip, water rising, stealing his balance. With a single, deliberate motion, he submerged himself entirely beneath the surface. The river swallowed the noise of the world. In that silence, the old foundations of the land were washed away. As he rose, gasping, the water streaming from his face, the transition was complete. He had anchored the soul of the nation to a new faith, and the current of history shifted. Kiev's hills cleared. Vladimir's shore climb began. The wooden idols, carved from centuries of tradition, stood defiant against the morning light. Men with ropes and iron levers swarmed the sacred groves. There was a moment of hesitation, a collective intake of breath from the city, as the first rope pulled taut against the grain of the ancient timber. Then, with a splintering crack that echoed across the valley, the primary idol tilted and crashed into the dirt. Dust billowed, choking the air, as the symbols of the old gods were dragged away and cast into the flames. The space they vacated did not remain empty for long. Stonemasons arrived, their chisels ringing against granite, laying the foundations for something entirely new. Within months, the skyline began to shift. Where smoke once rose from sacrificial fires, golden domes now caught the sun, glowing with a brilliance that signaled a new era. Art moved from the crude, singular forms of the past into the complex, vibrant iconography of the Orthodox world. The soul of the city had been rewritten. The transformation of the city was not merely physical. It was a profound shift in the collective consciousness. Within the quiet chambers of the new monasteries, the scratching of quills against parchment replaced the rhythmic chanting of the past. Monks labored for weeks over single pages, translating the complex geometry of Byzantine thought into the local tongue. This was the birth of a new intellectual lineage. The script itself, sharp and deliberate, began to appear on public decrees and private letters alike, binding the disparate tribes under a singular, literate authority. In the workshops, painters applied layers of egg tempera to wood, following the rigid, divine proportions imported from the south. Every stroke was a calculated act of devotion, creating a visual language that defined the sacred space of the home and the cathedral. The people began to see their world through this new lens, where every icon and every written word served to reinforce a shared destiny. Trade routes now brought scrolls and pigments. The prosperity that defined the Dnieper Valley reached its zenith, yet the winds of the eastern steppe began to carry a different scent. It was a dry, metallic odor that preceded a shift in the very air. In the autumn of 1237, the usual rhythm of the river trade faltered. Merchants arriving from the frontier spoke in hushed tones of entire villages vanishing into smoke. The scholars and monks, once occupied with the delicate work of illumination, now paused, their quills hovering over parchment, as the ground beneath the monasteries began to pulse with a low, rhythmic vibration. It was not the steady beat of a passing storm, but a frantic, uneven drumming. Birds rose from the marshes in silent, panicked clouds, abandoning the reeds. The livestock in the fields grew restless, straining against their tethers. On the eastern horizon, the clear blue sky was replaced by a thick, bruised haze that refused to dissipate. The local princes found their authority challenged. The earth trembled, a deep, resonant warning. The golden era of the Dnieper was about to be tested by a darkness that moved with the speed of a gale. The thunderous vibrations ceased, replaced by the piercing shriek of arrows and the roar of flames. The golden horde did not merely arrive, they consumed. Across the plains, the cavalry moved with a fluidity that defied the heavy fortifications of the cities. Stone walls, once considered impenetrable barriers, crumbled under the relentless pressure of the siege. Within the city gates, the air turned black with soot. The golden domes, symbols of a century of intellectual growth, collapsed into the courtyards, sending sparks into the dry evening air. The streets became a labyrinth of fire and chaos. Princes who had commanded the river trade now found themselves cornered in their own halls, their authority stripped away by the sheer speed of the onslaught. There was no negotiation, only the systematic reduction of cities to ash. The fields were trampled into mud, and the granaries were emptied. The proud leaders of the land, once masters of their own destiny, were forced to their knees. The silence that followed the destruction was heavier than the noise of the battle itself. The fires died, but the weight remained. For 2 centuries, the land endured a different kind of siege, one of silence, tribute, and forced travel. Princes, once lords, now servants to distant camps. They departed their homes in the biting cold, riding across the vast empty plains toward the center of their new master's power. The journey was a test of endurance, a slow march through a landscape that no longer recognized their authority. Upon arriving at the camp, they waited in the dirt, exposed to the harsh winds of the steppe, until they were granted an audience. Inside the central tent, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and raw leather. There, they knelt. They did not come as equals. They came to beg for the right to govern their own ruined cities. They offered gold, grain, and the labor of their people, watching as their requests were weighed against the whims of the Khan. Each prince returned home with the heavy knowledge that his throne was not his own. While the great centers of the land lay in ruins, a small, unremarkable town on the banks of the Moskva River began to change. It was ignored by the masters of the steppe, deemed too insignificant to warrant the heavy hand of direct oversight. In this isolation, the local princes saw an opening. They accepted the role of tax collectors for the Golden Horde, a task that required them to travel frequently between their own people and the distant camps of their occupiers. Each coin, a power lesson, and the exact limits of foreign control. Beneath the surface of their compliance, they began to hoard. They diverted a portion of the incoming wealth, storing it in hidden vaults and using it to fortify their own position. Walls rose, influence bloomed, quiet diplomacy. The year 1480 arrived with a demand for the usual tribute, but the response from Moscow was silence. Ivan III stood in the center of his hall, watched the Mongol envoy, and did not bow. He took the scroll of demands and cast it to the floor. The message was clear. The era of payment had ended. Golden Horde's army surged, a vast force sweeping plains to Ugra. Ivan III met them at the water's edge. For weeks, the two armies stared at each other across the narrow current. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the constant, low sound of horses shifting in the mud. Then, without a single charge or clash of steel, the Mongol commanders turned their horses around. Moscow stood, and for the first time in generations, it stood alone. Hordes void, fractured lands, steppe silence yields to marching boots. Moscow seized its neighbors' lands. Walls failed. Moscow's focus burned. They stormed gates, demanding union. Cold absorption, superior numbers, broken defenses, Moscow's rule. Iron grip silenced old rivalries. New borders forged a unified power radiating from the Moskva. 1,547's air shifted. Wood and stone braced. Cathedral thronged. Nobility packed. A ruler's quiet, measured presence. Ivan's boots echoed. A lone sound. Tsar's title echoed. Room shrank. Old borders dissolved. Autocracy's absolute reign began. The nobility bowed, their heads low, acknowledging the shift in the center of gravity. The power that had once been dispersed was now drawn into a single, unyielding point. With that one act, the fragmented past was buried. The state was a unified entity under one hand. The transition was complete, marking the birth of an empire. The consolidation of power within the city walls was only the beginning. With the state now unified under a singular command, the gaze of the Tsar turned toward the vast, frozen expanse of the east. Siberia was not a land to be governed. It was a wilderness to be conquered. The expansion began with the steady movement of scouts and armed detachments into the deep, snow-laden forests. They carved paths through the permafrost, establishing outposts that served as the eyes and ears of the central authority. The environment was unforgiving, with temperatures that could freeze metal and winds that erased tracks within minutes. Yet, the advance did not falter. Every village encountered was brought under the same administrative grip that had silenced the Western principalities. Resistance was met with swift, overwhelming force. The process was cold and calculated. Secure the river crossings, build fortified stockades, and extract the wealth of the land to feed the growing state. The reach of the state was no longer contained by the horizon. It had become a force that reshaped the map, turning the frozen reaches into a singular autocracy. The death of the Tsar left a silence that was far more dangerous than the roar of his reign. In the capital, the machinery of state ground to a halt. The iron grip that had held the provinces in check loosened, and the center could no longer command the periphery. Within weeks, the order of the realm began to fray. Famine arrived, not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, creeping starvation that emptied the villages. Fields lay fallow because there was no one to plow them, and the granaries stood empty, stripped by retreating garrisons. The roads, once the arteries of the empire, became dangerous paths where travelers vanished. In the absence of a clear successor, the nobility began to maneuver, their private agendas tearing at the fabric of the state. Local governors stopped sending taxes to Moscow, hoarding resources for their own survival. The unity that had been forged over decades dissolved in a matter of months. People fled the countryside, clogging the gates of the cities in search of bread that did not exist. The authority of the throne, once absolute, now existed only in name. Every town became a law unto itself, and the fear of what would come next replaced the fear of the Tsar. The era of stability had ended, and the long, cold shadow had fallen. The capital did not just fall, it was torn apart from within. As the central authority vanished, the gates of Moscow stood wide, inviting the wolves. Foreign armies marched into the city, their banners snapping in the wind, while local militias shattered against the cold reality of steel. The streets, once the pride of the empire, became a labyrinth of barricades and burning timber. Every corner held a new threat, and every alleyway became a site of execution. Pretenders to the throne emerged from the shadows, each backed by a different faction of the nobility, each promising order while delivering only more fire. The struggle was not for the people, but for the symbol of power itself. Combatants clashed in the squares, their blades ringing against stone, the sound drowned out by the screams of a starving populace. The snow, falling thick and fast, turned a deep, rusted crimson as the fighting intensified. No one was safe. Merchants, priests, and laborers were caught in the crossfire, their homes looted and their lives extinguished in the name of rival claimants. The city was a ruin of its former self, a hollow shell where the only law was the length of a sword. As the occupation tightened its grip, the chaos reached a fever pitch. The state had ceased to function, replaced by a brutal, unending cycle of violence that left the cobblestones slick with blood. The violence finally burned itself out, leaving only the hollowed-out skeleton of Moscow. The streets were choked with debris, and the air held the scent of charred timber and wet ash. Exhaustion replaced the frenzy of the sword. The warring factions, their resources spent and their ranks decimated, found themselves staring into the abyss of total extinction. It was in this silence, amidst the ruins of the capital, that the call went out. From the scorched provinces and the broken city districts, the representatives arrived. They did not come as victors, but as survivors. The Zemsky Sobor gathered in the shadow of the crumbling walls, a desperate assembly of nobles, clergy, and commoners. They stood in the freezing mud, their breath visible in the biting wind, huddled together for warmth and purpose. The weight of the nation rested on their shoulders, a burden far heavier than any crown. They looked at the ruins, then at each other, and the realization took hold. The cycle of blood had to stop. The bickering ceased, replaced by a grim, unified focus. They began the process of selecting a new path, a way out of the darkness that had consumed their world. The assembly was a fragile thing, a single, flickering candle in a vast, cold room. But it was the only thing standing between the land and total oblivion. The debate inside the chamber stretched into the freezing night. Voices rasped, tempers flared, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp wool and stale breath. Every faction pushed its own candidate, but the deadlock remained absolute. Then, a name cut through the noise. Michael Romanov. The chamber went still. The name did not carry the weight of the old, broken dynasties, but it offered a path away from the abyss. A murmur rippled through the rows of delegates. It started as a ripple, then grew into a wave of consensus. Men who had spent years fighting each other now looked toward the center, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a decade of war. There was no cheering, only a heavy, profound sense of relief that settled over the room like a shroud. The decision was made. The quill scratched across the parchment, the seal was pressed into the hot wax, and the document was held aloft. The time of troubles had reached its final, gasping breath. The cycle of pretenders and foreign blades was severed by a single, collective act of will. As the news spread to the streets, the silence of the city was broken by the tolling of a single, distant bell. The medieval era of fragmentation fractured and fell away, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of a new beginning. The crown had found its bearer, and the long, dark winter of the nation finally began to thaw. Michael Romanov moved to the center of the hall. He took his seat, and the floorboards groaned under the sudden, heavy stillness. The chaos that had defined the last decade did not vanish, but it stopped moving. Across the city, the fires were finally extinguished, and the smoke began to clear from the horizon. The fragmented provinces, long held by competing factions, slowly turned their eyes toward the capital. The borders, once porous and broken, began to tighten. Orders went out, messengers rode into the wind, and the machinery of the state started to turn again. The era of the sword and the pretender was over. In its place, a new, rigid structure took hold. Walls were reinforced, trade routes were cleared of debris, and the law regained its reach. The nation was no longer a collection of warring territories, but a single, coherent entity. The foundation was set.